Many of the students that will serve with disabilities in schools, both public and private, have what we call the term specific learning disabilities, or very often we would just say learning disabilities. And one has a learning disability within a specific content. So it would be a student on average, a student who's average or above average intellectually, but has a particular concern, say in reading or math. Sometimes we think about dyslexia and dysgraphia and dyscalculia as being specific learning disabilities. I am not a huge fan of this label as a term, the learning disabilities. And to think about that a little bit, I always think about my very first car. When I was a junior in high school, my parents bought me this car. I thought it was awful when I first got it. It was an old Ford LTD. It was 22 feet long. It was this boat of a car. As I had it over the years, I grew to love it. But on a certain morning, if the temperature was at a certain range and the humidity was at a certain level, being an older carbureted engine, I would go out in the morning to start it and it wouldn't start. And so on those mornings, that car was disabled. It wasn't able to move me from point A to point B, the farm I grew up on, to the school where I went to high school. And so we would think of the car in that condition as being disabled. When we think about a student who has a specific learning disability, these students aren't disabled. They don't lack an ability to learn. They simply need to learn differently. And so when I think about learning disabilities as a term, what I really think in my mind is a learning difference. And I think this is an important consideration to have for us as teachers. Because if we're teaching a group of students and we have one or two students who don't quite get the concepts at the same time or at the same speed of our other students, and we look at those students as people with a learning disability, a lesser teacher might use that as an excuse that it's not my fault as the teacher that these kids didn't learn, it's their fault because they have this learning disability. But when I think of those students, instead of having a learning disability as having a learning difference, then the responsibility does shift to me as a teacher, because it's my responsibility to come to understand how they learn differently and make sure that I'm presenting the information and the concepts that we're working through in a way that they can access. Because that's my job as a teacher, right? If I'm a teacher, I need to be concerned with both teaching and learning. If my job is just to present information, then I don't need a teaching degree. I need to learn how to be a presenter. But as teachers, we're concerned about teaching and learning. And so it's up to us to solve the mysteries and solve the puzzles of those learners that we have in the classroom who simply learn a little differently. And so for me, again, that idea, not a learning disability, rather a learning difference, is a great way to conceive of these folks. When we think about how students with learning disabilities have been identified over time, we used to use a model called the discrepancy model. And this has been out of fashion in schools really for about the last 20 years. But in that old model, we would give students an ability test, say an IQ test, and then we would give them an achievement test. So what's their raw intellect as it relates to math? How are they performing in math? And if there was a discrepancy of 20 on those two tests, then we said that child had a learning disability. Today we really use professional judgment. We rely on the judgment of the teacher and other personnel within the school to make that determination. And again, it's one particular area. When we think about the definition of learning disability, it has both an inclusionary clause and an exclusionary clause. And so the definition says that the child has an issue in one or more areas related to the psychological functioning of learning. That's the inclusionary clause, there's an issue. The exclusionary clause is we can't explain why. So there is this disruption in function and we don't know what it is. It's not an intellectual disability, it's not a lack of exposure to education, it's not something related to behavior. And so that's how we conceive of a learning disability. Funny enough, if we really think about that, so let's take someone with dyslexia. I think this is kind of the common conception of what a learning disability looks like. Technically, if we were following that definition, someone with dyslexia wouldn't count as someone with a learning disability because we know why they have a hard time with reading, and we can explain that. So it doesn't meet that model of there's an issue and we don't know how to explain the issue. Understanding that then, that we have some interruption in a psychological functioning that leads to learning, we have to look towards divergent ways of teaching those students. And it's not always related to an academic concern. Many years ago, I had a student who came to me, and her sister-in-law, her brother and her sister-in-law had a child. She was in the 4th grade. In the 3rd grade, she'd been identified as having a learning disability as it related to reading. She was enrolled in a Catholic school but received support from a public school, and they just weren't able to move her ahead in her reading levels. She was just staying stuck at that 2nd grade reading level, and she wasn't making any progress. And so the parents were looking for ways, looking for tutoring, and they had identified, they lived in St. Joseph, Missouri, and they'd identified a tutoring program in Lawrence, Kansas, which is about an hour and a half drive. And it was very expensive. I think it was $15,000 a year. And it would require her going from St. Joe to Lawrence 4 days a week after school. So a huge time commitment, a huge financial commitment, and a lot of time for that child away from the activities that typically she would be doing. And so this aunt came to me and said, my niece is in this situation, and they wondered if I knew of any tutoring that was closer or less expensive. And I did know of somebody that had really good luck with using a model called alphabetic phonics. And I said, but I'd kind of like to know a little more about the child before I make this referral. And so they were kind enough to share the student's IEP with me. And so they brought it in, and I read through it, and a few days later the student came back to ask if I had an update. And I asked if the young lady, the 4th grader, wore glasses, because as I looked at the difference in her comprehension and her fluency, it didn't make a lot of sense to me. Her comprehension was really solid, but her reading fluency was bad. And one of the things that I'd come across years ago was an anecdote of a high school baseball player. He was a pitcher, and his baseball coach was concerned with his pitching and sent him to an eye doctor. And when he got to the eye doctor realized that the student, or that high school student, had a tracking issue. The ocular muscles in one eye were stronger than the other eye. And this was related to his pitching and the trouble he was having with his pitching. It also was related to the fact that he'd been diagnosed as having a learning disability and had a hard time reading. He couldn't track, right? And when we read, we open a book, we start at an upper left-hand corner, we read to the right, we drop down to the second line, we read to the right, we drop back down. If our tracking is off, think about if you've tried to read a book before you go to sleep at night. If you're super tired and you're trying to read a book and you find yourself reading a line over and over and over again, that's what it was like for this student all of the time, because his eyesight, not his eyesight, but the muscles in his eyes were off. And so as soon as he went to the eye doctor had set up a system where he wore a blindfold or a patch. I like to make pirate jokes, so we'll call it a patch. And his weak eye followed a red dot across the wall, right? It's sort of a human cat trick situation. And just like exercising any weak muscle in the body, after a few weeks, that weak muscle was stronger. It matched the strength of his dominant eye. He was able to pitch more effectively. He was able to read more effectively. And that comprehension fluency was a tip to me that maybe that's what was going on. But it turned out this 4th grade student did wear glasses. And anytime we go to the eye doctor, we have to do that, right? We hold the plastic patch over one eye, we follow a red dot, we switch, we follow a red dot. And I thought, so for sure, if she'd had glasses, tracking had been investigated. And so I said, oh, that's too bad. I thought I had a real simple solution. And the student asked me, well, what was it? And she relayed that story to her sister-in-law. And as Providence or luck would have it, a week or so later, she was at the eye doctor. And the mom said to the eye doctor, did you test tracking? And for some reason, the eye doctor didn't. And so he did that test on that visit. Sure enough, one of the eyes was less strong. The same type of red dot therapy, and within a couple of weeks that student's reading level had vastly improved. And so a lot of it is investigating those things. Now, I only knew that because of luck. I'd happened to hear the story years before. I thought about it when I looked at the IEP, and sure enough, it worked out. There's lots of similar stories that don't work out quite so well, things that I really had to investigate and try a lot of different things to help students learn. But this is the world of learning disabilities, trying to figure out what works. One of the other disabilities in this area that's come up a lot lately is something called an auditory processing disorder. And I didn't hear about this probably until around 2005. And in the beginning, I think I was teaching a class to some graduate students, and one of them had a child with auditory processing disorder and was sort of venting about the lack of support she received from the schools, and like some teachers saying that that was something that had been made up, this idea of an auditory processing disorder. Now we know a lot more about it, and I can pick out my students in class who have that issue every day. I can just see the look on their face during a lecture, during the presentation of information, or if I'm meeting with them in my office, they simply process slowly. They need more time to input and evaluate information. It's not that they're not intelligent. It's not that they aren't good problem solvers. It's that they simply need more time. And so in the class, when we try to do things like having adequate wait time, so if we're going to ask a group of students a question, we want them to have some time to process before they answer the question. And think about when we were in school. I remember one of the things, second, third, maybe even fourth grade that we did a lot to practice our mathematics fact was a game called Around the World. And so, one person would stand up and walk to the desk in front of them. Both students would be standing up. The teacher would hold up a flashcard. Whoever got the correct answer first would move ahead, and the goal would be to get all the way around the room back to your original seat. Well, that type of game works really well for fast processors. It doesn't work so well for slow processors. And so the unintended consequence could be you have perfectly intelligent children that process a little slowly that always fail at a game like that. And so what can we do to make sure those folks with auditory processing issues have the adequate space to process and to think as they're learning new information? It goes back to that Vygotsky idea that we talked about in another video. It's the stepping stones of learning. Some students just need stepping stones that are closer together. I think of one particular student I have right now. She's a delightful woman. She processes slowly. And so I've made a deal with her that I'm never going to ask her to contribute in class unless I'm standing next to her. And so this is a visual cue that I've created, only she knows about it, that when I work my way around the room during a lecture, I'm not going to call on her unless I'm standing by her. And so that's a really simple way to handle that. I also remember I'm a whole word learner, so when I was in school, my fluency was really bad because I can't pronounce a word I've not heard before. And I remember in the 5th grade, we were reading Tolkien's The Hobbit, and my 5th grade teacher did a lot of round robin reading. And so I sat in the very first row. I was the 5th person in the row. And when we got out our books to read aloud, I counted down to the paragraph that I was going to be reading, and I started practicing it in my head to make sure that I knew all the hard words, the big words. It's just like if we are lectors at Mass, right? We read those readings ahead of time to make sure we know the cadence and we know the words or anything that might be hard. And so I'm sitting there reading the paragraph, and once in a while the kids in front of me may have tackled a really long paragraph, so the teacher had 2 people read it, or maybe there was a short paragraph and one student read 2 paragraphs, and when it got to me, then I started the wrong paragraph, right? And everybody in the class laughs. But that was really an accommodation technique that I had to use for myself. And so knowing that if I'm going to have students read aloud in class, and I have students that that struggle with reading out loud, what I do is I take a photocopy of that paragraph and I enlarge it. Instead of the small print like in the book, I blow it up a few times and I give them that paragraph ahead of time so they can practice it. And so that's another way that we can engage students with these concerns. Something we talked about in another segment, if you can provide notes ahead of time, that can be helpful for a student who learns differently. In math, there's some things that we can do for kids who learn math differently. We can rely on manipulatives. I think things like the Khan Academy or YouTube have been great. I was having dinner last night with some family friends, and we talked about how she had learned to knit using YouTube. And we joke that we learn everything today on YouTube. I don't have to hire somebody to fix a lot of things on my car anymore because I watch a video on YouTube and then I'm able to go do it. And so for students who do learn differently, maybe we can find video resources that allow them to review the information ahead of time or afterwards so they can just have more contact with the information. I think folks benefit from kinesthetic learning, anything that we can learn that's a process that somebody's doing. I pulled my students one year and I sort of asked them of the most memorable experiences they'd had in their elementary classrooms and their middle school classrooms. And I remember for some reason, and it was kids from all across the country, but all of them had remembered doing a unit in on World War I in a junior high social studies class where they got a lot of cardboard boxes from local appliance stores and they built trenches, right? Trench warfare is a World War I characteristic, and they built these trenches, and they could all spend lots of time talking about how they built them and why they built them and what trench warfare looked like. So for these students, learning activities that are hands-on, that require problem solving, that require activities, these are all ways to include these students. And again, like we talked about earlier, these methods of teaching don't just benefit the students with the learning differences, they benefit all students. All right, so that's specific learning differences.